Hello, I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. Welcome to Bubble Pop. This is the weekly show where we talk about some of the biggest headlines and juiciest news tidbits so you don't have to doom scroll. And for season 2, as I said last week, we're doing it live, baby. So it's just a reminder that if you want to support the show, you can do so on Patreon, Substack, YouTube, as well as anywhere you like to listen. You can also use the super chat function on YouTube while we're live to ask questions that we'll do our best to answer at the end of the episode, provided they're appropriate. All right, so let's pop your bubble. Today, I am so honored to have primary care physician Yipeng Ge back on the show. He's been very generous with his time with Bubble Pop. Yipeng has previously been on the ground providing aid in Gaza amid the genocide. He's traveled with the activists who tried to march to Gaza to break Israel's deadly siege, and he spent time on board a previous recent Freedom Flotilla that tried to do the same, carrying medical supplies, prosthetics for children, medication, and other essential humanitarian aid. But on top of his relentless, fearless advocacy to try to end Israel's genocide in Gaza and Canada's complicity, he's also worked on and studied the structural and colonial determinants of health here at home. And given we just marked the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, we're going to talk about that too. So without further ado, let's bring in Yipeng. Yipeng Ge, welcome to Bubble Pop.
Thank you so much for having me, Rachel.
Thank you for being on the show again. I'm constantly barraging you with requests to do this podcast, so I really appreciate it. So I wanted to start things off by talking about the Samood Flotilla. You were previously on board of the Gondola, which is one of the flotillas that sailed before this one. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience and what it's like on board of one of these vessels?
Yeah, of course. And it's so good to be chatting with you again like this, because the last time we chatted was when I was on the Gondola boat. I was sitting on it, and I remember chatting with you in that capacity. And the Gondola boat was the 37th boat sent under the Freedom Flotilla coalition, and it started as the Free Gaza movement back in 2008. So the first 4 boats actually made it to the shores of Gaza under the Free Gaza movement. But since 2008, only 37 boats have been sent up until the Gondola. And with the global Samood Flotilla, which came as a grassroots movement because of some of the organizers from the Global March to Gaza. And they had to think their strategy after being stopped in Cairo and Ismailia to not be able to advance further to the Rafah border. To have the 4,000 activists, volunteers from all over the world try to march to the Rafah border to demand entry of humanitarian aid. They sent over 40 boats in a matter of these past few days, but there's also more boats and flotillas on their way under the 1,000 Madeleine boats to Gaza and the Freedom Flotilla coalition as well. So there's more boats on their way as we speak that are sailing on the Mediterranean Sea towards Gaza. And I think it's also just a reflection of how much the movement for Palestinian liberation has grown to see this amount of escalation by the people's movement, an activist movement for a liberated Palestine, because these boats are not only carrying humanitarian aid and just everyday ordinary volunteers and activists from around the world who took time away from their jobs, their families, their lives, and some really incredible stories of people like selling their car to be able to do this and to be on these boats, to be in solidarity with the Palestinian people and their right to exist, their right to life, their right to liberation. It's not just carrying humanitarian aid, but it's a symbolic gesture, a presentation of the need for governments and states to do this. There's for the Samood Flotilla, at least, there's 44 different international countries, citizenships represented, and these are the states and the governments that are responsible, including many more around the world, that are responsible for breaking Israel's illegal siege, but also responsible for punishing and preventing genocide. which as an international community, we have utterly failed to do so. But they are filling that gap that is left open by states and governments because they failed to do what is necessary in this moment to punish and prevent genocide and to end illegal occupation in the West Bank. And it also is a highlight to the necessary things that we need to do when we have privilege in this world, when we hold foreign citizenship. Our lives somehow matter more in this world to people, to governments and states. So we have to put our bodies on the line to do what we can. And it also highlights the absolute need for Palestinians' right to return. There are many Palestinian friends and comrades who want to be on these boats, who should be on these boats, who should be able to return to their traditional, indigenous territories, but are unable to because of Israel's colonial project that is continuing to expand in the region and continuing to expand with American support into the Gaza Strip. As we can see, it's a colonial project.
Yeah. It must be a really powerful thing being on board a boat of like-minded people who are all so steadfastly dedicated to opposing a genocide, especially in the face of the failures of states. I'm just wondering if you could describe a little bit emotionally how that feels being on board.
I think it's a really special feeling to be surrounded by people who not only share similar politics, but actually their worldview on how we get things done in this world. How do we create the change necessary is that we are the ones that create it. We don't sit around and wait for governments and states to issue their statements and follow through with their actions because we know that they haven't. And just to be with people who, from once again, like all walks of this life on this planet, from different professions, and there's also language barriers and things that we have to work through. But it's beautiful to be with people, having spent some time with the Alhamdulillah Freedom Flotilla team, to know that there are people all around the world who refuse to stay silent, but also refuse to do nothing about it. So they're doing everything that they can, actually, within their power, as a volunteer, as someone who has experience in activism, as someone who has experienced sailing boats. It is such a beautiful intermeshing of experiences of people sharing what their skills are, what their capacity is to be able to go on these boats and sail to Gaza, because not everyone can has the expertise to do that. There are people with that expertise. And I remember spending time with people who have done a lot of this work on the seas to protect refugees, to protect migrants, to document the crimes that the European states have against the movement of migrants from North Africa to Europe to escape, political violence and persecution, and to be repressed in that experience, to see their work of being on the seas to document these things. Is just seeing a lot of the intersections of social justice, but also environmental justice activism work, convalesce on Palestine, which is such a beautiful thing. I remember learning about people who also are part of sea shepherding, which is to protect against illegal crimes against environmental causes like overfishing and protecting the seas. And so you have people that do all these different kinds of social activism work to make this planet a better place, who are the helpers of this world, who are like Francesca Albanese, the UN Special Rapporteur on Palestine, says it, are the antibodies for a healthy society. And to see them all kind of come together on the issue of Palestine, because Palestine right now is the moral issue of our time. It is the Holocaust of our time. To see everyone kind of put in what they can in terms of their energy, their skills, what they have to offer, and to do this, and to see the Samood Flotilla, to see the 1,000-man Lean Flotilla, to see the Freedom Flotilla, flotilla, coalition flotilla, and there will be more, because we've seen how Israel can't actually stop every boat. And I think the more that people like see the work of these kinds of direct action, we'll be able to grow the movement towards a full liberated Palestine. But this is not only about Palestine. This is about colonialism and structural oppression and racism and discrimination and environmental, abuse, like all over the world, because people see how their social justice work, their movement for liberation, for their peoples, for their land, is connected with Palestine in this moment. It's just so clear, I think, for so many people, and to be with people that not only have that sharpened politics, but have this paradigm of, this is how we get things done. We're the ones that do it, and we will put in the work, and we will find the people to do it with.
Yeah, I think one thing that was really incredible is, we know waking up today that Israel has illegally kidnapped the activists from all of from the Samood Flotilla boats. However, we also know that as they were illegally intercepting these boats, one of them actually made it into Palestinian waters. Which I believe is the first time that's happened in many, many years with this flotilla movement. And as you mentioned already, more are on the way, like the Conscience and the Thousand Madeleines. So I guess I wanted to ask you, how do you feel seeing this huge effort still be quashed by Israel, but also have these little moments of breakthroughs and of unwillingness to give up? How has this week felt to you as someone who's done this relentless advocacy work?
I think when I saw the Handala boat back in July be intercepted by Israeli forces, I was actually extremely gutted. I felt like that boat, for some reason, I think maybe just because of spending time with the boat and with the people on that boat, I just felt like that boat was going to make it for some reason. There's this kind of like radical optimism that I held, that no, this boat's going to make it. It's for the children of Gaza. How could they stop this boat for the children of Gaza? It had baby formula, it had prosthetic limbs for the children. And Howeida Araf, who was on the first boats that arrived and was part of the initial movement way back in 2018, she was on that boat, right? And I felt like something was going to happen. I felt like it was fate that boat was going to make it. It did not. And just seeing that interception happened live was gutting. But when I saw what the Samood Flotilla was going through, I actually didn't have that same reaction, because I was seeing how the Israeli forces were not very effective in stopping over 40 boats. And you just mentioned the Mekeno boat that was actually able into Palestinian territorial waters. That's the farthest any boat has gotten, I think, since 2008, when the first few boats actually arrived, just a few miles off of the shores of Gaza. And actually, it allowed for Palestinian fishermen to fish, because the Israeli Navy was busy, tending to activists trying to bring in humanitarian aid. And so there's actually a lot of successes from the Samood Flotilla already. Of course, I'm very worried about my friends and colleagues and comrades who are on those boats. Like, I know multiple Samood Flotilla boats, but I know that Israel will probably detain them, maybe torture them, maybe hurt them a little bit, but they will be released and deported in time. This is, their experience of repression by the Israeli forces is incomparable to what Palestinians in Gaza are still going through. And they know that too. Having spent time with them, they know that their lives are not more valuable or meaningful than a Palestinian.
Oh no, it looks like Yipeng's connection just got lost. Hopefully he'll be back in just a moment. But in the meantime, I think what he was saying was really powerful. It really struck me what he was saying about the fishermen being able to fish It's a bit absurd, the reality that they were doing so in the context of Israel's forces trying to stop humanitarian aid from being delivered. But the fact that these fishermen were able to fish and were able to do that because of this effort just goes to show how one boat can make a difference, because these fishermen were able to feed their families because of that. And that is truly incredible. Yipeng is back, so I'm just going to bring him back on. Thank you. I know he's joining us from, I believe, his clinic, so the connection isn't necessarily as good as it might otherwise be. But welcome back, Yipeng. We are just chatting about how wonderful and inspiring it is that the fishermen were able to potentially feed their families because of that one boat that got through. So it's truly inspiring. I did want to ask you about the Canadian government's reaction. We do know that there was at least one Canadian passport holder who was detained as part of the Samood Flotilla, and there are more Canadian passport holders on the way. I reached out to the government this week, and I asked them what they are going to do for the flotilla, including for the Canadians who are traveling to Gaza. In their response, they told me, quote, "The government of Canada is not able to guarantee the safety of Canadian travelers or to provide them with security and protection abroad." What do you make of that, particularly in the face of, other states providing said aid? The Irish Foreign Ministry saying that they are going to assist citizens who were illegally intercepted. They didn't use the term illegal as far as I saw, but we know it's an illegal interception, as well as the Colombian government expelling Israeli diplomats, South Africa's president requesting the immediate release of those abducted. What do you make of Canada's inaction?
Well, it's interesting you bring up Zahira, because she's actually one of my friends. I met her in Toronto, and I actually spent time with her in Cairo, in Egypt, doing some mutual aid work for Palestinian families who are living in Egypt, in Cairo, because they've been forcibly displaced, ethnically cleansed from Gaza. And, to see the Canadian government not only not care about their own civilians, but not do everything within their power under their own obligations under international law, things that they've committed to, because we live in, this like rules-based order after World War II, where we've set up the United Nations, we've set up things like, the Prevention of Genocide Convention, not only prevention, but punishment as well, to say never again in this world. And yet we're seeing it happen again, actually live streamed right in front of us. And, Canada has very easy things and actually obligations under international law, like stop sending weapons to the perpetrator of this genocide, to end trade, well, at least to reevaluate that trade agreement, to sanction Israel, and to also prosecute Canadian institutions and individuals that have committed war crimes in Gaza under the Israeli military kind of banner. And these are the most decent things and the most basic and most moral and legal things that bring Canada up to its own standard under international law, like obligations. But in addition to that, there's also the responsibility of bringing in humanitarian aid to a besieged population, because we live in this international, social world order where when something happens anywhere in the world, we're supposed to help them. And Canada has repeatedly failed to do so, along with so many other states, in allowing Israel to forcibly withhold the aid that they choose to the entire Gaza Strip. You cannot be asking the occupying military force that is committing genocide against a population in a confined, geographic location. You cannot be the ones asking them for permission to bring in things. You actually have to break that blockade and that siege. That is an obligation and responsibility of all states and governments, including Canada. I remember when there were boats under, I think, Italy, under Spain, that were supposed to accompany the Samood Flotilla, and last minute they all chickened out and left them out to dry. But there was also, I think, a Canadian Navy boat that was in the region as well. And so why didn't Canada send that boat, not only to protect the Samood Flotilla, but just to bring in aid? Right? We've seen time and time again, Israel has continued to systematically withhold necessary things like food, water, fuel, medicines, medical supplies, baby formula from entering the Gaza Strip. And every human rights organization, every humanitarian organization that's basically been working on the ground in Gaza, including the United Nations, is calling this genocide. What are we still doing? Talking? What are we still doing with statements? Canada has even threatened sanctions against Israel a couple months ago with other countries, but there is no actual action. And so I think for so many of us, especially us in Canada, like Canadians are I think rightfully furious and enraged that when Canada has a role to play on the international stage, when Canada says they, are, really like wanting to advocate and advance women's and the rights of girls and females, like this has been a huge priority for the Canadian government, at least under the Trudeau government. It shatters all of the things that people have once thought of what Canadian values are, what Canada's role is on an international stage, and we're just capitulating to fascists. We're capitulating to Trump's America. We're capitulating to Netanyahu's Israel, and we saw how Carney even applauded like Trump's plan for a complete takeover of the Gaza Strip, a colonial plan in cahoots with Israel. So when Canadians are seeing this, I think we have to absolutely hold our government accountable for their actions on the international stage, their actions at the United Nations General Assembly. Oh my gosh, I can go on and on, because I remember just a few days ago seeing our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Anita Anand, speak at the United Nations General Assembly, telling, we're asking Israel to protect Palestinians. We're asking Israel to protect, healthcare or hospital institutions, that they shouldn't be under attack. When that very day, Israel attacked Nasser Medical Complex, hitting a nurse who's working in that hospital, with a gunshot wound to the skull, to the head, with an Israeli drone. So it's just absurd for Canada still to be asking Israel to protect Palestinians when Israel is the one committing genocide against Palestinians, as concluded by the United Nations. And the absurdity that our federal foreign affairs minister can say this at the United Nations General Assembly. How does that not make a farce and a humiliation out of Canada on a world stage? I truly think it does, and there's so much work to be done to kind of repair that. If Canada wants to step on to the right side of history, the best moment is now. I don't know. The more that we see this happen, and I told you earlier, the more insane I feel. Like if we are seeing things for what they are with our eyes wide open, and to see Canada capitulate time and time again to Trump, and to Trump's America, and to Israel, it's bringing down an entire international rules-based order that Canada was applauded and applauds itself for setting up after World War II. So it's disappointing, frustrating. It doesn't even, I think, put it. I think it's just, I feel like we're going insane the more that we continue to see this happen.
Yeah, well, it feels like they have no respect for the intelligence of their own citizens to be able to stand in front of us and tell us that the things that we are seeing and hearing aren't what's happening. Like it's ridiculous and so insulting that they think we're stupid enough to believe that. I mean, you've been on the ground in Gaza. I know I've asked you this before when you've been on the podcast, but I think it's so valuable to hear because of the fact, especially that international journalists aren't allowed in. There's incredible Palestinian journalists on the ground risking their lives every day to bring us reporting and to bear witness to this genocide. But while I have you here, I was wondering if you'd be willing to share with us what sort of things you saw when you were there.
Yeah, of course. I worked in multiple primary care clinics in Central Rafah last year in February, so like a year and a half ago, more than a year and a half ago. And I was supposed to work at Nasser Medical Complex, the hospital that's made, I think, multiple news cycles because it's been attacked multiple times. Once, on live television where it was double tapped by an Israeli airstrike, killing tens of journalists, first responders, including medical students, including Mohammed El Habibi, who was a final year medical student, and it was his 24th birthday, and he was working at the hospital to become a doctor, and he was killed in that series of airstrikes. I ultimately didn't work at that hospital because it's surrounded by Israeli tanks and later besieged by the Israeli military while I was in Rafah, in the primary care clinics that I worked at. And during that besiegement, doctors, nurses, patients were abducted, were killed, were thrown in mass graves, and buried around that hospital. And healthcare was specifically targeted. Like the Israeli military cut off the probes of ultrasound machines to make them inoperable in the future. And you only do this because you want to destroy the last line of defense for a Palestinian civilian population that is just trying to continue to exist on their land. The primary care clinics that I worked at in Central Rafah did not have basic things like antibiotics, like Tylenol or Advil for pain management. We brought these medicines and started to prescribe them, but that is not a solution. For a few international doctors to come in and bring a few suitcases worth of medicines for a population at that point in Central Rafah was 1.4 million is not a solution. And just seeing like the children that came through the clinic that I worked at, the majority of patients I saw were children, some of whom were just so starved and malnourished. They were already skin and bones at that point, a year and a half ago, and only recently are people talking about there's famine. People have been taught the threshold to call things like something like famine is very high, but there was forcible starvation in Gaza just a year and a half ago because of that blockade. And that blockade actually is an 18-year old blockade, because I remember seeing patients or seeing children that would greet me at the clinic because there's no school, they don't know what to do, so they just hang out at the clinic. They would greet me and say, what's my name? How am I doing? And I thought that these children are much younger than they appeared. But then I later learned from other people at the clinic, no, these kids are actually older. They've been physically stunted because of that existing 18-year blockade on what can enter the Gaza Strip, namely food and supplies, and necessary things for survival, for aid. And there's that long-standing Israeli policy of limiting the caloric intake of the entire Gaza Strip. And to see some of those things play out right in front of me, it was just a reminder of the impacts of colonialism on Palestinian people as indigenous peoples to that land. I remember seeing a child as approximately 9 to 10 years old who was just skin and bones. He was being carried in by his mother.
no longer able to walk when he was previously able to walk. And I could wrap my index finger and thumb around the upper arm and the lower leg of this child. And, we were told by the World Health Organization, you should use a measuring tape. We didn't even have measuring tape. We didn't have anything, barely anything. And, but I didn't need such a tape to know that this child was in need of, severe, was in severe conditions and needed, really intensive therapy. Like, if I saw this patient in Canada, you would, admit them to a pediatric hospital for refeeding, to monitor them so that they can, be in a monitored situation to kind of recover. I spoke to the local doctor, who was also not a local doctor, who was, displaced from the north. And he said, well, there's no such resource. And all we could offer this child was IV fluid. IV fluid, which just introduces another source of possible infection, irritates the child, makes the parent or guardian, or sometimes it's family member, sometimes it's someone else, it's just a friend, because some children are just completely alone, right? Like wounded child, no surviving family, and it makes for a situation where one of the other doctors is working with at that time, a year and a half ago, called it like torture. Like we're just torturing some of these kids by just giving them IV fluid, when what they needed was nutritious food, clean water, decent shelter, all of which was being targeted with airstrikes or systematically withheld by the borders, all these like kilometers and kilometers of aid trucks not being let in. And she called it torture. And I agree with her. I think it's a form of medical violence where when patients do not have the things necessary for their survival, and you do medical interventions like IV fluid to try to prolong their life, but you also prolong their suffering. So you do question, like, are you doing more harm than good? And so that I think comes to mind a lot. And I didn't have the experience of this, but I know other healthcare workers have, which is like doing operations, doing surgeries on children without anesthetics. And like, what does that do to the child? What does that do to the healthcare worker who's also from that community, who's trying to save their people, and you signed up to do no harm, and you're doing this kind of work, and it's not a reflection of Palestinian healthcare. It's a reflection of the illegal blockade. It's a reflection of the Israeli attacks on healthcare, where the Israeli military have systematically attacked the hospitals and clinics over and over again. The primary care clinics that I worked at in central Rafah last year no longer exist. And before they were destroyed by the Israeli military because they invaded Rafah, that clinic actually functioned basically as a morgue to store dead bodies. It wasn't functional as a clinic. It became a place to store dead bodies from the multiple Al-Mawasi tent massacres over the course of last summer. And it was just awful to see a place that used to be where kids would play and laugh, a place of healing, a place where people would come to get healthcare, a place of life, has been turned into a place of death, a place where dead bodies are stored, a morgue. And that is because of Israel's attacks on healthcare, but because of the policies of attacking healthcare and this incessant need, I think, to advance their colonial project, which is genocidal in nature, which is just death and destruction at its core.
The whole time that you were describing just this nightmare, this intentionally inflicted nightmare, I couldn't stop thinking about the fact that that was February last year. How do you reflect on your time in Gaza now, knowing how much worse the world has allowed Israel's genocide to get?
I mean, I think about how we have failed, how some of us, who have been there and left, we thought maybe if we just told the world what we saw, maybe if we pressure our governments and explain to them what we saw, that they would change their ways. But it was a really important lesson for me to know that that's not the world that we live in. To present the facts doesn't make people in power, people with political and capital and economic interests, to change their ways. It's people power, it's movement power that will put the necessary political pressure on states, on governments, on companies and institutions to change their ways. It's the only thing that ever has. I knew that to an extent, but I didn't know how much people will go to support Israel and support Zionism and support settler colonialism in Palestine. It was, but also what a privilege to learn that. Palestinians have been telling us for decades and generations the truth, and so many of us have been doing what we can, and we've been treated like how Palestinians have been treated for decades and generations. Been labeled as terrorists, been labeled as anti-Semitic, been labeled as spreading lies, been labeled as all these things, and we are not, by simply wanting Palestinians, like any people in this world, the right to self-determination, the right to life and dignity, and the right to simply exist, to simply just exist in this world without, bombs falling over their head. I think about the healthcare workers that shared food with me, and they really encouraged this, to break bread together, to spend time together, and to eat together. And now the same healthcare workers who I'm in touch with, they can't feed their children, they can't even feed themselves. They're still working night and day to look after their people and their community on an empty stomach. So we have so much work to do. I keep thinking about how people ask me, how do you keep going? How do you have the energy? What do you mean, right? Like I have a roof over my head. I have food in front of me. I have money to spend. I'm not the one with bombs dropping over my head. We have so much work to do to end the forms of complicity and active involvement that our companies in our backyards, our governments and states are so entrenched in the catastrophic suffering and extermination of an entire peoples. And I think about what someone asked me a few days ago. It's a question not, I think, for people who are tuning in, but it's for a question other people who haven't acted, despite knowing, is how are you so comfortable with other people's catastrophic suffering? How are people living their lives and are so comfortable knowing what's happening in Palestine and not doing anything about it? So I think that's where I end up. It is action, it is solidarity, it is the work of the flotillas, but it's also the work of the march, but it's also we have our own demonstrations and direct actions and marches here in Ottawa. There's divestment work that is happening with our pension plans. There's divestment work within our own hospitals, and so there's so much work to be done, and that's our responsibility to do. Like there's so many fronts that are worth fighting, and yeah, we are not the ones to give up. We have a responsibility. We have to keep going, because my Palestinian healthcare worker colleagues, they're going and they check in on me still, and they, and it's just like they're checking in on me. The humanity of these people, they're checking in on me.
Wow. It's, as you're describing much of this. It's also making me think about the disparities that exist within our own healthcare system here. Obviously, it's nowhere near the same, but I do think that given that it was just the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation this week, I know that you've studied the impact of colonial and structural determinants of health, and just describing the impact of a colonial project on the health of children and of a people. Canada was born of a colonial project, and the legacies of it continue to impact communities, especially in the healthcare system to this day. And I was wondering if you could maybe speak to that a little bit, you know, to try to also bring this conversation home in that respect.
Absolutely. I studied the impacts of settler colonialism on health here on Turtle Island before I studied the health of Palestinians in occupied Palestine. But it's because I studied the impacts of settler colonialism on Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, Métis, on the land in which I had the privilege of growing up on. I didn't have the choice of growing up and living on occupied, stolen land in Canada. I was brought here by my parents at the age of 4 for a different life that they saw opportunity and privilege for me and my younger brother. But then the more that I learned about the history of Indigenous peoples on this land and the genocide on this land, residential schools, the 60 scoop, the social and the child welfare system, to learn of these atrocities and to know that I have benefited from the genocide of Indigenous peoples on this land, I am moved to do something about it. I am moved to, I think, do allyship work, to do accompliship work, and how do we move to like solidarity work, whether it be within healthcare or any other sector, to be able to move towards decolonizing these systems that continue to be entrenched in colonial ideologies that subjugate and create the conditions for colonial violence and erasure of Indigenous peoples on this land. And it's only because I've studied that I've had the privilege of studying Truth and Reconciliation Day just a few days ago. I actually called Ms. Waskin Agnew, who is a harm reduction worker. She's Cree and Dene, based in Toronto, and she was on the Conscience boat sailing under the Freedom Flotilla coalition banner. And as I was calling her and we were recording our conversation so we could share it later, the boat actually took off. It sailed, and we were reflecting on truth and reconciliation. We were reflecting on how Canada has so more to go, but also truth and reconciliation only became part of the mainstream dialogue because of residential school survivors and the community pushing and organizing for the Canadian government to recognize, for the general public to acknowledge, to think about these things. So there's so much more actual truth and reconciliation, reparations for Indigenous peoples to be had in Canada for true land back for sovereign Indigenous First Nations on this land. But to reflect on, what every child matters actually means, we actually have to mean that beyond our own understandings of colonial borders. Borders are colonial in nature. And so when we think about Palestinian children being killed and slaughtered en masse in Palestine, they are Indigenous children to that land, and they deserve our solidarity as well. And so it was just a beautiful conversation I had with Ms. Wasson about how she's carrying that legacy and wisdom and strength and resilience from her grandfather, who was a residential school survivor, and doing that work, being on that boat on its way to Gaza right now. And what an honor it is to kind of, befriend people like her, and to have worked with Indigenous communities here on occupied Turtle Island, or so-called Canada, to work with Inuit and Nunavut, to work with Haudenosaunee First Nations at Six Nations, the Grand River, like to be in community with Indigenous community members, scholars, researchers, clinicians, patients. They have taught me so much about this lifelong commitment struggle to decolonization. And what that can look like is ultimately moving towards sovereignty, moving towards full self-determination and land back. But to kind of get there, we need to raise the consciousness, we need to organize, we need culturally appropriate and safe services, we need to really reconcile, but ultimately I think we just really need to reconcile with the idea of a foundational idea that colonialism is genocidal in nature, and colonialism is at the root of a lot of these systems, including the system of medicine, and how medicine as an institution has had colonial ideologies embedded within it to be able to experiment on Indigenous children, nutritional experiments on Indigenous children, or the forced sterilization of Indigenous and Black women. Like, these are ongoing legacies and acts of the medical institution. So that is the work that the profession needs to do to kind of decolonize itself, to be able to really give health and well-being back to the people who have been entirely subjugated by the system of colonization, to the point there the Canadian government has used things like education and healthcare and housing as means to displace Indigenous people. So there's a lot more that we can do. There's so much work that we have to do. But if the foundational work of understanding colonialism as the root cause of poor health outcomes, but also social outcomes, isn't understood, then we won't get very far in truth and reconciliation and reparations for Indigenous peoples.
Yipeng, thank you so much. This whole conversation has been just, I think, so much of what we need right now, especially in a week where we've seen so much cruelty, we've seen so much residential school denial, we've seen so much genocide denial of Palestinians. And I just appreciate you showing up with so much empathy. We've got about just under 10 minutes left, but and I think Yipeng's a little frozen right now, but I'm hoping that he'll come back. But I wanted to give you guys the opportunity. If you had any questions, you can use the super chat. I'll prioritize those questions, but we probably have time to take a couple if you want to drop them in the chat for Yipeng or myself. And I don't know if he's still frozen, but I'll give Yipeng the opportunity as well to tell us where people can follow his work and advocacy while folks take the moment to put their questions in the chat. Okay, he crashed again. So I'll go ahead and tell you guys where you can keep up with. Oh, there we go. Yipeng's back. So if Yipeng wants to tell you guys where you can keep up with his advocacy and his work while you take a moment to put some questions in the chat. He has to leave by 1, so I'll have to cut you guys off a couple, like 2 minutes before then, so he has time to breathe. But Yipeng, do you want to tell them where they can keep up with you? Oh, I think you're muted. Hang on, there we go.
There we go. Yeah, I'm on Blue Sky, X, Instagram, and LinkedIn.
Just under your own name on all those platforms, I believe, right? Just Yipeng Ge. Right.
Wherever
Okay,
I can
fantastic.
get information out. Yeah, in a world that I think it's harder to, receive and find information.
Okay. I'm not seeing too many questions in the chat, but there is just one here asking how, what's the answer to colonialism for a country? That's a pretty big question to just put on your shoulders, Yipeng, but for a country like Canada, which has existed for not really hundreds of years, actually, less than 200, but how do we resolve this? And they said, start by asking Indigenous people what they want. Do you have any additional thoughts on that?
So you can ask like Indigenous peoples on this land, but also Palestinian people in Palestine. They are not a monolith. So whoever you ask Indigenous peoples all around the world, what is the solution? What does decolonization look like to them? You might get 100 different answers, but ultimately it is peoples as the peoples that have been subjugated to colonial violence and erasure, that deserve reparations, that deserve reconciliation. It is up to them to kind of chart their path forward. But as an outsider, I think what I've seen work well, and at least what the colonial objective is in places like Canada, in places like Palestine, what has happened is a dismantling of sovereign, Indigenous-led initiatives and systems. For example, if I think about what's happening in Palestine, Israel is specifically targeting healthcare because it was and still is to some degree Palestinian-led, Indigenous-led. But the way that they're targeting it and creating the conditions for more outside actors to provide healthcare, it is to dismantle that system so that it makes a population entirely dependent on another group, in the way that Canada has made Indigenous peoples dependent on a healthcare system that is run by not themselves, is dependent on an educational system or housing system run by oftentimes not themselves. But we're seeing initiatives led by Indigenous First Nations, Inuit, Métis people in Canada that is self-determined, that is guided by their principles and ideologies and worldviews. And the more that we can look towards those solutions that are contextual to a very specific kind of community, then I think we get closer to a world where Indigenous peoples have sovereignty, have land back, have the ability to take care of their own communities, and are not used by the state in exploitative ways for land grabs, for whatever political points that the state wants to kind of move forward at the expense of Indigenous peoples and Indigenous rights. It's I think ultimately a reckoning with the system of what we actually have right now. We have a state, our head of state is still the Governor General, which is an extension of the British Empire, right? So we are so occupied here, and how do we really kind of dismantle some of those ties from Britain? How do we dismantle ties so that First Nations, Inuit, Métis are sovereign peoples and we can be appropriate guests on their land? And there's a lot of work to kind of get to that, but I ultimately believe that that is actually what is necessary for a planet that can heal from the impacts of land extraction, from resource extraction, from genocide, from illegal occupation, apartheid, because those things have happened here by the Indian Act. I was speaking with Ms. Wasson just a few days ago on Truth and Reconciliation Day, and she was telling me how the Indian Act was the blueprint. The Indian Act in Canada was the blueprint for apartheid in Palestine by Israel. And so the ways in which these colonial powers use policies and colonial violence to subjugate is not just affecting the indigenous population, it affects all of us, because inequality makes a sicker society for all of us.
I know you only have like 1 more minute. We did get one super chat question that was wondering about your relationship with the Haudenosaunee, as they had an original agreement in the Silver Covenant chain, as the Crown is obligated to this. It's not through the Indian Act. I'm not familiar with the specifics of that, so it's not really something I can speak to. I don't know if you are, Yipeng, but I do want to thank you for the question regardless. Yipeng, I don't know if you have a 30-second answer that you want to take a crack at, but...
I mean, my quick answer to like my relationship is I grew up in a place called Waterloo, Ontario, which is just, very close to a short drive away from Six Nations of the Grand River. I went to school doing my undergrad in Hamilton, Ontario, which is also similarly very close to Six Nations of the Grand River. And that was the place that I spent time with, and I'm in touch with, water and land activists based there at Six Nations who are Haudenosaunee, who, for example, like Dawn Martin Hill was like the pioneer of like creating the Indigenous Studies program at McMaster University, because she went to university to figure out what happened to her people. And being with people like her and people from our community has taught me so much about colonialism, has taught me so much about how do we actually work towards a society that is life-affirming and not centered around genocide, centered around colonialism. I don't think I've specifically answered your question, but I mean, like that is the relationality, I think, with how I try to carry myself and honor the things that people have taught me and continue to teach me.
Great. Well, Yipeng, thank you so much for your time. I know you have patience to get to, so I really appreciate you squeezing this in. It was an incredible conversation, and I think I speak for everyone when I say we really admire you, and Canada is, and the world is a better place for people like you who show up even when the odds feel impossible, even when governments and so many people with power fail us, that people like you show up and make a difference and show what kindness and compassion and empathy looks like. So thank you, Yipeng, and hopefully I'll badger you to come back soon.
Thank you for having me, Rachel. Appreciate your reporting and voice also, as always.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for listening to this week's episode of Bubble Pop. I'm Rachel Gilmore, your least favorite person's least favorite journalist. If you enjoyed this episode, consider subscribing on YouTube, Patreon, Substack, or wherever you like to listen. You can also find me on TikTok, Instagram, Twitch, and Blue Sky. I'd like to give a special thank you to Hans Vivian Wenzel for making the incredibly groovy music for Bubble Pop. You can find more of his stuff on Spotify under the artist name Hans. That's a lowercase h with an exclamation mark. Thank you again for spending this time with me. This is my dream job. I know I say that every week, but that's because it's true every week, and I couldn't do it for 1 second without your support. So thank you, and I'll see you next time.